They brought the thing in before dawn, when the frost was blue on the lichyard and the ravens had not yet bothered to settle arguments. The old porter at Winterfell's gate had lit his brazier and was rubbing warmth into his hands when 4 men came up from the King's Road with breath like smoke and a burlap sack that bled no blood. The leader wore a black cloak stiff with rime and a beard clotted white at the chin. His eyes were the color of old iron, and he would not come in from the cold until he had seen the Lord. So Ned Stark dressed without a word, not to wake Catelyn, and tied his hair back and went down. The great hall was dark save for the orange pit of the hearth. Roderick Castle had roused himself too, his whiskers wild, a sword belted over his nightshirt, and Maester Luwin stood blinking like an owl with his chain wrapped twice about his neck. The man who wore black kept his hood up until he had crossed the straw and reached the Lord's table. He made no obeisance, which might have irked some southern lordling. Ned's line ran older than the iron chairs of the South. He was not troubled by plain need. "Lord Stark," the Black brother said, "I am Dagon Pike, sergeant of the garrison at Castle Black. I have ridden with 3 men through the night." "You have my welcome and my food," Ned said, "and my ears. Show me why you have ridden my men to bones." Pike set the sack on the table and drew open the stained laces. A smell came out like wet stone and snow that has lain too long over something that should not be found. Luwin flinched, which Ned had not seen him do at the sight of ruptured bellies or the burns of Smith's ash. The sack's mouth yawned wide. Inside lay a hand and a forearm to the elbow, pale as milk glass and puckered where the flesh should have sloughed. The fingers were long and black-nailed. Frost steamed from it even in the heat of the hall. "It does not rot," Dagon Pike said. "We hacked it from the wrist of a corpse that walked. It did not bleed. It moved in the fire like a living thing until we pinned it and cut it free. It has not blackened since, nor softened, nor—" He cleared his throat, a raw sound. "It will move again if you put it in the dark." It was nonsense from a tale. Most nonsense has a shape. Ned felt the old horror pull at a place below the breastbone, the way old Nan's stories used to pull at him when snow stung his cheeks and the wind howled down the broken tower. He looked to Luwin. "Maester!" Luwin had the hand in both palms, plainly not eager to keep it but unwilling to let it drop. "Lord, there are herbs and salts that can preserve flesh. There are tricks known in the South to make a limb twitch by heat or mercury under the skin. But this—" He set it back in the sack with a careful disgust. "This is cold as the wall. I will examine it." "We burned the rest," Dagon Pike said, "all but the head. That we brought south to the Shadow Tower to show Lord Mallister. It had blue eyes even in the ash. We set it in the armory and barred the door. When we broke the door in the morning, it was gone, and the bars not bent, and the floor tracked with snow though no snow had fallen. Roderick Castle made the sign that men make when the sea takes someone. It was not the gods would sign. "Eat," Ned said, "because there were forms, and men are steadier in the daylight. You will tell me all of it. Then you will sleep. Then you will tell me again, and I will not change my mind after sleep. In the gods' wood the heart tree drank what it always drank." Ned stood before it after the Black brothers had been fed and half-drunken and stumbled to pallets by the kitchens. Mitchin the steward had taken the sack and set it in a cellar at Luwin's word, locked and with ash strewn thick. The leaves of the weirwood hung heavy as tongues, red as murder. He put his palm against the old notch where a boy's hand had fit once and closed his eyes. Snow might be coming, he thought. It always was, but some cold goes beyond. In the South, he had learned that men can busy themselves with tournaments while the ground under them is hollowed. He had learned other things too, the weight of a promised thing. He had not yet paid all those weights. When he went back, Luwin had set braziers and brought salts and vinegar and iron spikes hammered from the smith's scrap. He had his books out, and a dozen candles wept fat tears around the slab where he had laid the arm. The fingers had curled as if sleeping. He prodded them with an iron and they did not flinch. "Heat stirs muscle," Luwin muttered, "and lightning will dance in dead flesh, aye, and a frog's leg will kick in brine. But this strong cold, this is—" He bit off whatever it was and shook his head. If I speak the word you are thinking, I will be laughed from the citadel out of old men's mouths. And yet, Ned said, they set a torch to the hand. The fingers jumped then, a thin spasming like the first shiver of winter on a lake. Ned's belly clenched against his will. He held the torch closer. The skin did not char. The frost steamed and ran in clear drops that hissed on the iron. The dead fingers clawed towards the fire as if to grip it away. Llewyn steadied them with a bar, and the iron frosted where they touched. Roderick swore, softly, reverently, like a prayer. It should be in the night, Dagon Pike said late that day, thick with exhaustion, when Ned pressed him for every detail. It is worst in the night. That is when they move. That is when we hear their feet crunch snow where no men have trod. How many? Ned asked. He had ordered only meat and small beer and a map of the wall laid out. Not many, not enough to make a host, but more than there used to be. The sergeant rubbed the heel of his hand against the bridge of his nose, the way men do who do not want to be thought weak for rubbing at their eyes. Men vanish. They come back. We burn them now. Good, Ned said. He looked down at the wall, the castle strung like beads, the white blank north of it. The map always lied. The great spaces had no ink. They hid names like the Thens and the Frostfangs, the milk water threading a valley that could swallow the whole of the riverlands. He traced one finger up at Eastwatch, where the sea kissed stone. What of the men at sea? They have not seen them, Dagon said. The sea keeps its own dead. Ned dismissed the man and went to find Llewyn again. He stood in the maester's turret as the first chips of evening tapped against the windows and listened without interrupting to a story that was not one story, but many. Llewyn had dug up old accounts from the Winterfell library, not read in many lords' reigns, the parchments crisping to dust at the edges. There had been winters of a sort that men forgot to call winter later. There had been old weapons buried with old kings. And once there had been a thing that no book named clearly, as if ink itself feared, and afterward the sun had looked different when it came. We should write to Lord Commander Mormont, Llewyn finished, and to White Harbor to ask for ships in readiness if men need to be ferried along the wall. We might, he hesitated. Lord, there is talk in one chronicle, an old one from your forebear Edwyle's day, that the first men used a certain stone against the ancient enemy. The Septons later called it foo nonsense. But the men who cut flint from the high moors told a different tale. They called it Dragonglass. Obsidian, Ned said softly. The word had an old taste, a little sour, like words for food he had eaten once and not since. My father spoke of the knives his father kept in the treasury, broken and pretty. He said they were good for skinning fish. He said the blades shattered if you looked at them crossly. Flint and bone and obsidian were used before iron, Llewyn said. But the book says obsidian is something more. Says it bites cleanly. It says it bit the cold things that iron could not. There was a pulse then, not of fear but of recognition, as if the Godswood's heart had answered an old question deep in the dirt, and the answer was not a sentence but a feeling. Do this, and do it as if you mean to live. Ned looked down at his hands. They were a lord's hands, mostly. He had killed men with them and wiped boys' tears with them. He had held Robb when he took his first frantic breath, and he had closed Brandon's eyes. They trembled slightly, with a sentience that told him he had tried not to make this choice for years, and he had failed at not choosing. Send Pike back with 5 carts of lamp oil and 100 torch heads. And the hand, he said. He can carry my words. He will have a stark letter when he rides out, and the wax will not be cold yet. He met Llewyn's gaze. We will arm the north. With what? Llewyn asked, though Ned could see in his eyes that he already knew. With stone that bites cold, Ned said, and left a silence where there might have been laughter in another place. Men say that secrets in the north do not stay buried, for the ground itself spits them up in spring when the melt loosens the earth. This secret did not belong in the ground. It went into casks and crates and quiet conversations. It went to White Harbor on a fast horse under the hand of Hallis Malin with a private word for Wyman Manderley. a word about a debt the Manderleys owed to Winterfell for this harbor they held and the law that kept it theirs. It went south on a ship that cut the bight with a pale sail and a stomach full of coals and wool and good northern timber, and tucked in the hold under the timber a coffer with the Stark seal, which in turn went ashore at Dragonstone under the lee of black cliffs that smoked in damp weather. It took 3 weeks to be received by Lord Stannis Baratheon. The Lord of Dragonstone had a mouth like a scar and a reputation that came before him and left hard lines in the faces of his stewards. He read Ned's letter 3 times, his lips moving, though he was not a man to mumble. Then he said, "This is a jest," with no trace of humor, and when the steward flinched he added, "Not on Lord Stark's part." Cresson the Maester put the glass candle aside, though it was only a candle of glass, and lifted his head. "It is not unknown," he said. "The Dragon's Mountain makes the stone. We have caves full of it. Men have been cutting it for knives since Aegon's day. It is pretty and cuts well if you are careful. It dulls quickly. We will pay," the Stark letter had said. It spoke little of reasons, nothing of wights or moving hands or eyes like shavings of ice that were not dead eyes. It spoke of the wall and duty. It spoke the language Stannis understood. So the first cargo of obsidian from Dragonstone for the north went out under cloud at dawn, with a crew that did not ask questions because the master wanted no questions and paid out hazard pay in coin that bit. The men whispered anyway, for sailors whisper. The black stone lay under the pine planks and creaked when the hull creaked. When the cargo arrived at White Harbor, the Manderley factors wrote numbers and counted and nodded, and did not charge a fee that would be remembered. In the yard at Winterfell, Mikken swore at his workmen until his face reddened to match his nose. He was not a man meant for obsidian. "There's no temper in it," he told Lord Stark. "It's glass. You want me to treat it as if it were steel? It will turn a blade good once and then break your heart." "You will not make swords," Ned told him. "You will make sockets, rings, rivets. You will teach boys to mount a sharp thing to a shaft so that when it breaks, a man's hand will not break with it. The mountain clans know how to fix flint. Learn how to fix glass." He sent for men out of the hills. A little came with his hair in a tail and his hands scarred with old cuts, and showed them how to strike flakes out with antler and how to press the edge by pressure without shattering the whole slab. Norreys came down with baskets. A wool came not at all, but sent a girl with arms like saplings and eyes narrow with mistrust, who could turn a chunk of dragonstone into 22 barbed heads in the time it took Arya to set a needle through a torn hem. Mikken's jaw set. He made copper collars that gripped the base of each head, and he had rings forged that bit into the wood of a spear as you drove the shaft home so that the glass would not fly out backward when it struck. He cursed the whole time until the first time he watched the stone eat an oak beam when iron heads had only splintered it. "What is it you intend, my lord?" Catelyn asked him when he came to her chamber with ash in his hair. She had not asked until then. She had a patience that men sometimes mistook for agreement. "I intend that my grandchildren not be taken from their beds by a cold hand," he said, and thought of Robb's laughing face when a hound had knocked him down that afternoon, and of Jon's quiet smile when Bran made a clever answer to a hard riddle Luwin had set. "I intend to act. We cannot arm the whole north against a tale. We can arm it against winter," he said. "If no cold things come, we will have better arrowheads and knives and a story to tell of how a lord went mad for one long season. If they do, we will have something to bite. And the South will laugh." "The South will always laugh," Ned said, "and sometimes it will weep. I don't plan for their laughter." She took his hand and turned it over, tracing the line of an old scar that ran from thumb to wrist. "I know these hands," she said. "They do not fidget without cause. So I will not scold you for spending good White Harbor silver on folly. But," and here the Tully came out in her eyes, as steady as the river that had raised her, "be wary. When men lay by a thing for a winter that may come, their neighbors may covet. And the South is always itself." He kissed her and promised to be wary. He broke that promise many times and then honored it tenfold in other ways. That winter turned slow and only sharp at the end. The obsidian arrowheads went into barrels lined with old cloth and oil and were sent by cart to keep by hearths and by night to the outlying holds. He wrote to each of his bannermen with a hand that cramped less than men assumed. They wrote back with answers like the men themselves. The Umbers sent back a laugh and a request for 10 more barrels. The Karstarks sent for 4 smiths to learn the mounting. Roose Bolton sent polite thanks and asked, in his dry way that could be read 3 ways, whether the stone was good for flaying. Ned sent him 20 more barrels and no jest. At Castle Black, Lord Commander Georg Mormont paced on the high walk above the yard and blew clouds from his beard and said to Eamon, "He believes." Maester Eamon's eyes, milkied with cataracts, did not turn. "A Stark believing is like a tree putting down a deeper root," he said, and tapped his staff once on the board. "It cannot be shifted in a storm." The first cart came to Eastwatch by the sea, packed with black stone and spindles and a letter that had not a hint of tales in it. Only orders, only care. Cotter Pike read it and spat in the foam and said, "If the Lord of Winterfell wants me to shoot black glass at the wind, I will. But it will be poorer sport than gulls." He had whalers break off their harpoons and mount the fat barbs with glass. The whalers swore when the first heads shattered in a serpent's spine, and then swore to have more. A year passed, and then another. Children were born. A boy died of the quinsy at Barrowton, and his mother cut her hair. The Riverlands had a bad harvest. Tyrion Lannister came through Winterfell with a tongue like a knife and a nose red from drink and a heart that surprised Ned in its shape. Jon Snow asked to take the black because the world offers you sometimes one door that is yours. Ned gave his bastard leave because love and duty are not always enemies, and because he looked at Jon and saw a thing in him against a winter no one would call by name. On the day Jon left, Arya cried behind the stable and would not be comforted. Robb walked a long time with Jon and came back with his eyes rimmed dark but bright as a dog's when you take it out to hunt. Theon Greyjoy made 3 jokes and threw a snowball into Bran's hood. And later, when no one watched, he went up on the battlements and stared toward the east where there were ships. Ned watched him from the Godswood and did not call. He remembered a boy he had once been and a different wind. Benjen Stark came to Winterfell in a blizzard and went back north with 3 wagons and a lecture for Jon about sleeping in furs and not in pride. "This is foolish," he told Ned in the solar, stamping melt from his boots. "Your stone will not keep men warm." "My stone may keep them living," Ned answered. "Gior will be grateful. But there is something else. Men in the haunted forest vanish. Not just men. Sound vanishes. We sit our horses and hear our own hearts. Sometimes it is a blessing," Benjen said, and his smile was a rough thing and gone quickly. "Sometimes you find afterwards that you miss the sound of snow. It's quiet in a way snow should not be." Ned gave him more barrels and a kiss on the brow like their father had given them when they were small and came in half frozen from the pond. "Give this to Mance Rayder if he asks for mercy," he said, pressing into Benjen's hand a small packet of heads wrapped in oiled leather. "Tell him the walls we build are not always the ones that save us. Some walls are made of men," Benjen said, which was an old saying and true. Summer came in from the sea and hung over White Harbor in a wet haze that made the fish stink more than usual and the flies breed like little courtiers. Wyman Manderley made jokes to his cooks and sought more black stone, and his factors sent scrip south to Dragonstone with careful math. Stannis took the money and sent stone and went on counting resentment like sensible men count grain. When King Robert stopped at Dragonstone in a fit of affection, men always read wrong. Stannis had 3 barrels of obsidian arrowheads set out in the hall. Robert laughed and said he had thought his brother did not like pretty things. "You'll have the realm shooting glass birds from the sky," he bellowed, and he drank until he forgot to be angry with his brother for whatever old crime it was. Stannis did not forget. He wrote to Ned Stark and said only, "I have sent more. The boy at the mint is cheating on the copper issue. We have stamped too much tin. I recommend you watch your factors." Ned read this and smiled, and felt less alone. That autumn, one of Umber's boys brought a woman out of the Wolfswood, long-limbed and barefoot and with hair like mud and frightened fox eyes, a spear in her fist made from a sharpened bone. She had 3 more women with her and a child with hair so fair it was white as corn. They said the dead had been seen on the far side of the gift. They said a village in the foothills had gone silent. The women were wildlings by their speech and by the clothes made of skins and sewn with gut. They were not southern pretty. Caitlin watched them from behind the rail as they stood in the hall and did not beg and did not bow. Osha, the tall one, said only, "You are a lord with sense, they say. The dead move." Ned said, "Here we burn our dead," and gave them food and a low place by the hearth and a man to watch them and an old room near the back and a place to sleep, because his father had had the same habit when travelers came with wind in their hair and a need in their hands. Rob wanted to watch the women throw their spears. He liked to see how different men fought. Theon wanted to take them to bed, because that was how he talked about what he did not understand. John was gone already. Arya trailed them around like a puppy and learned from Osha how to tie a slingshot that did not split in the first cold and how to twist a strip of hide so that it bit equally into either side of the stone it held. The women stayed a week and then went on with 3 buckets of salted meat and a bag of arrowheads that they had not asked for and did not thank him for. As they left, Osha said, "Your god's wood is thick," which was a compliment in her tongue. Ned bowed in answer and watched them slip into the green. He looked at the trees that had watched men die and be born. They seemed indifferent, but the indifference of trees is not unkind so much as vast. Snow came early that year, and in the snow came a deserter from the night's watch, his horse staggering, his breath in tatters. He wore black, but not the black a brother wears when he is not running. He had blue upon him in the eyes. Ned knew what was required and did it himself with ice, the blade his father's father had used for men and never for meat or timber. Afterward, he took Bran to see the thing in the god's wood. He did that because he had done it as a boy himself and because he felt a pressure inside him to do everything that could root his children where they stood. There was a strange purity in the act, and a cold that got into a man's joints worse than any wind when he took his life into his hands so deliberately and offered it to a law that did not care what men felt. After, as they rode back through the drifted paths, they found the dead direwolf and the living pups and all the tangles of fame and death that follow such finds. But those knots wound differently in this telling. For in Winterfell's armories there were now barrels of black points and racks of shafts bound with leather to keep them straight, and the men who went to collect the pups went with one eye on the trees as men do when they have heard a kind of story that might be true after all. The pup with the red eyes went to Jon anyway, and the white of him was a promise if men had known it, that sometimes the gods got their teeth against a thing and refused to let go. When the king came north with all his trouble and joy, he found a holdfast cleaner than he expected, with a lord narrower of speech and richer under the quiet. Robert had always liked Ned because he did not have to do much to be liked. He swung Ned about and shouted for ale and for meat and for women to sing. He stepped into the god's wood with the heavy gait men have when they enter a church they do not love but fear. He told Ned jokes that were old at the Eyrie, and he poked fun at Jon Arryn's ghost, and he tried to get Caitlin to blush with a story about a camp follower. But there was ash in his cake that day and in all his days after, and that ash was the South working in men's bones. He asked Ned to be hand, and Ned said yes because he always said yes to duty, but the plan he had set in motion did not need him behind every cart to move. When he left Winterfell, there were barrels of Dragonglass at Last Hearth and Carhold and Bear Island and at Deepwood Motte and in a freshly cleaned magazine at the Dreadfort that smelled of old damp and new fear. There were sacks of heads at every holdfast and a pair of sockets in every captain's kit and a little book that Luwin had written at Ned's urging, full of instructions so simple even a stubborn man could follow them. "Stab the White Walkers with Dragonglass," the book said on its 3rd page. "Burn their wights with fire. Do not waste steel on them. Aim for where bone would be if they were men. Do not break the arrowheads with a poor shot. Do not look into their eyes. Do not speak to them. The cold will kill you first." At Castle Black, Jon met Samwell Tarly and made a friend because you cannot always tell which rescue will be the key to a lock half a world away. Alliser Thorne sneered at the glass arrowheads until he saw what they did to a slab of frozen pork. Then he sneered differently. Jeor Mormont had a barrel up on the high walk, and when the first wight came clattering at the gate one night like a drunk man's vision, they did not hack at it long. Pike drove a spear of Dragonglass into its throat, and the thing burst open as a frozen puddle breaks when a heavy boot comes down. The smell afterward was clean and terrible. In King's Landing, Ned found rot he could not burn with any stone, and a boy who was not what he ought to be, and a queen with hair like gilded straw that smelled of honey and arsenic. The South did to him what it always did to men like him. It took him in its coils and squeezed. But the coils were slower now, because a man with a mind full of winter cannot go so quickly to sleep in a place that smells of summer and roses masking piss. He wrote to Lewin every week with little things: this bannerman trustworthy, this one not. Send more heads to Moat Cailin. See to Bear Island's need for arrow shafts. Have Wyman send Stannis a cask of salt beef with his next stone. He told no one everything. In the haunted forest that no map showed rightly, a band of rangers came upon a ring of night around an old weirwood. In that ring the snow lay like a white sheet on a dead man. The rangers held back. They watched. In the night a line of blue lights came down the hill like a string of beads, and in their light the snow hissed. The rangers did not loose arrows, though their hands itched. It is hard to strike first at a thing that moves like your fear. Then, all at once, something moved too quickly for the eye to catch, a rush of pale, and Jaren made a small sound and toppled. There was no blood. The others appeared, one on the left and one on the right, the air clouding around them in tiny crystals of frost. The ranger at the fore was named Waymar once, a boy with a cloak made from rich sable, but he stood his ground like ice. He put obsidian on string and loosed. The arrow flew with a chirp like a sparrow in summer. It struck the pale thing in the throat and sank to the fletching. The crack that came then was pure as a bell. The pale thing opened along a seam it did not know it had, and its face was 1,000 fragments of sky. The rangers ran anyhow. Courage does not keep men. Terror does. They carried Jaren's bones back in a sack of skin. That winter John went ranging with Corrin Halfhand, and they came upon a cache of obsidian knives wrapped in oiled cloth in a ring fort on the fist of the first men. Just as in the tale men tell in inns to strangers to see what kind of stranger is listening. But the cloth was newer than it should have been, and the knives freshly napped by a hand that knew a modern wheel. There was a little note in a canister of tin, written in a small neat script. "Do not break," it said. "Do not waste. Aim for the eyes." John held that note and felt a line run straight to his Lord Father's hand. He did not cry. It was too cold and too dangerous. Mance Rayder came down to the wall in number and loud. He came with giants and mothers and old men and wolves. He came with his hands open and a song he did not sing. Stannis was not there to meet him yet. Jeor Mormont sent for a parley, and because Ned Stark's letter had said a thing, and because he had asked Benjen for a mercy once and not gotten it, he gave this one. The talk was short. "The dead want us all," Mance said. "We don't have kings. We have children. And rules," Jeor said. "And oaths." "Your oaths will not warm a boy," Mance said. "Your glass might." He nodded at the barrel near the gate. "We came to bargain. We will not go back north of your wall. Not all of us. Not without fire in our hands." The bargain that was struck would have made a Septon curse and worse. The free folk to move into the abandoned forts along the wall's length, to be given barrels of blackheads and torches and the right to cut timber in the new gift if they swore to guard and to burn and to hold a horn when they saw the white things move. Mance swore what he swore because he knew what he knew. Bound words mean less to free folk than to southern lords, but even free folk respect winter. There was fighting nevertheless because men like to choose their enemies and the Watch had trained to hate. John stood in a space where choices cut him and did not once ask for pity in his face. The first time a wildling woman with hair like copper loosed an obsidian-tipped arrow down off an abandoned tower and shattered one of the pale things that glided up the path like it was water. The watchmen stopped arguing and learned a new angle to all their old prayers. On the King's Road south of Moat Cailin, news travels on boots and wagon wheels and old tales. The news that came then was muddled by southern tongues making northern noises. It told of wights beyond the wall and glass arrows, and a lord who had paid for barrels of shiny stone to be shipped from a dragon's home. Men laughed over their ale and spat, and some of them forked fingers like the small folk did when a comet came. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister heard such a tale from Pycelle, who told it with a dry cough and a roll of his eye as if to distance himself from it, as men do with truths they do not love. She laughed and said it would be like a Stark to spend good coin on old wives' tales. "Tell me how the hand spends," she added idly, "and then tell me how to spend him." Ned wrote to Luwin, "Keep the younger lord near the armory. Keep the girls near the godswood. Do not put faith in Lord Bolton. Send Manderley a cask of winter wine from my father's stocks. He will warm to it. There is a man here who deals in secrets, called Littlefinger. Teach Rob how to lose a little each day and yet end with more. The letter did not mention Dragonglass, because some words reached farther than a raven's flight if men chose to make them longer. The hand of the king was a shadow thinner than the man. The South did to him what it always did to men like him. This time, though, when the sword fell on his neck, it fell in a different place. Because the king, Fat Robert, in his cups, had said 2 nights before, "The North always sends me bacon and stone and complaints. Ned, you have sent me something else. You have sent me a story. I have not had a new story in years. Pleases me." He said that before they hunted and before he died of a tusk and a conspiracy and his own hungers. A man who dies earlier in the tale shifts everything behind him. Did hear. A rush of hands tried to replace the space a king leaves and found they were too small and too many. And in that press one boy pushed another boy aside at the wrong moment on a gilded staircase. And a knight of the Kingsguard took a cut he had not meant to take, and a different man shouted a different word. Ned Stark, bleeding and shackled and stubborn in his honor, lived 3 days longer, and those days were enough for a raven to reach the fingers, and for a little man to make a joke at the right time, and for Sansa to sob so piteously at the foot of a queen's bed that a queen remembered her own first terror and let a sentence be delayed. The axe still fell as axes do, but it fell later in a different square, and by then the North had been sent more than letters. Rob rode for war with a different weight in his saddlebags. He rode with a codex for mounting glass on spear and arrow and with 2 mules carrying barrels of heads. He called his banners, and the lords came because Starks had always been a thing to follow in the North. They brought their standard hung with glass heads on strings like ebony fruit. Caitlin rode too far north for a southern lady and had her heart broken in more than one direction. But she set her jaw and did not tell anyone what it felt like to carry grief like a flask you dare not drink, because you will not stand up again if you do. The War of 5 Kings became a War of 4 and then a War of 3, and in the telling some things changed that are not the marrow of this story, and some things stayed the same. The phrase found new ways to be themselves. But when the dead came out of the bar Rollins one night in the pearly fog and moved through the stones as if they had grown there, Rob's men did not hack at them with good steel and weep when steel made no mark. They set them alight with pitch and rags they had in pouches for that very use. And when a pale rider came behind the fog like a shard of noon, they did not run until the last watching you run. Meege Mormont stuck a spear with black at the tip into its ribs and watched it break like ice in a cup. Then she drove another spear into the one behind it, because you cannot make a tale from a single strike and live to see it told. Word of that went as far south as Old Town in due course, altered at each hearth and made a little ridiculous, because men fear what they cannot wage war against with honor. The maesters argued in rooms with windows set into stone and looked to the stars for an answer about cold. The citadel is a place where men would rather be clever in a circle than useful in a straight line. But even there, a certain acolyte with angry cheeks and clever hands copied Lewin's booklet on the binding of stone heads to shafts and smuggled it to his uncle in Dorne, who kept it because he liked oddities, and because he liked the idea of a North that did not send only wolves to a fight. That winter broke, and then set in again, as real winters do, with false thaws that tricked the unwary into putting their tools away too early. Along the wall, men learned new habits. The free folk in their towers called to one another by horn and by name. The watchmen on the wall wore gloved hands over their glove and still felt pain. Jon Snow went where men asked him to go because he had the habit of obeying when the voice in his chest agreed with the voice in his ear. He slipped into Mance Rayder's ragged court and walked back out again with frost in his hair and a different tilt to his jaw. He killed a man he had liked and a woman who had not begged and a thing that was not a man at all. He came back with knowledge that moved like an ache. He came back with a wolf who hunted the night for him. Benjen Stark did not come back. They went north with 3 men and came back with 2. Men told stories in the yard in the evening about the place they had seen him last, a stand of pine where the wind whitens. It did not matter how they told it. The thing was the same. Sometimes men do not come back, and their absence is a shape you carry until you set it down and it turns out to be the sky. Then the thing that had always been coming came. It came not as a charge but as a tide. North of the wall, the forests exhaled a fog that did not sunburn away. Up the milk water came it, on black feet that left prints the frost would not fill. The free folk in the thens did not sing that night. The horn at the shadow tower sounded 3 times for the first time since it had been cast. The ice of the wall itself sang in little chimes that made men weep and not know why. At Eastwatch by the sea, a long dark broke on the horizon where water should be water. Men stood on the pier, silent, and watched something move that was not moving water. Wights cannot cross running water, say the old tales. The sea that night was a mirror and ran like no river. The first of the dead came in over the wet sand, not like men who walk but like the thought of footfalls. Cotter Pike put a coral through one and saw it tumble without care and get up again. He had his men set their lines and tip their harpoons in black heads. When the first of the pale things came in with them, holding death like a banner, he pulled the horn free of its lash and blew once and then again, until his chest would not take more air. At Winterfell, a raven woke Luwin from a sleep that had been thin and confused by odd dreams in which his chain was a snake that did not bite but only watched, which he found more terrifying. He took the message upstairs to the Solar. Robb, only half a lord still, widened his eyes and then narrowed them. Catelyn stood and did not sit again. They sent for Mikken and for Hallis Malin and for Ser Roderick and for every captain who could read and those who could not. They unsealed their barrels. The barrels gave up their contents like a grandmother giving up a hoard of sweets saved from scarce summer. The spear shafts were oiled. They slid sweetly into sockets. The arrowheads wrapped in oiled cloth came out black and keen and cold to the touch. The men who had scoffed did not scoff now. They did as they had been taught. South of the wall, the air was different. It remembered better. But even there the dead came out of old barrows where the farmers had long since forgotten there was anything under the hill but stone. They came cold up from the ground in the flint hills and moved through the crumholes, the little twisted trees that grow where no other life can bear to lay a root. At Barrowton, the women lit great rings of pitch and straw around the mound of the first king and held the hands of their children, and still the children did not cry because children know when a fear is for living through and not for making a noise about. Heads in black came off the warehouse shelves like beads and went onto shafts. The first pale thing that came off the hill stepped into Madame Barbary Dustin's courtyard there like he had a right to be there and died on a spike of glass that the smallest groom drove through his chest. Madame Dustin smiled with all her teeth and said to no one that her father had once told her he wished lords were scholars. She had married badly. She had learned much. At the Dreadfort, men stood on the battlements with black-headed spears, and Ramsay Bolton laughed for half the night, which was not a pleasant sound. He laughed because his dogs would not howl, and that unnerved him. He laughed because his father did not change his face when there was the sound of something striking the gates like hail. He laughed because there were screams among the small folk, and some of them were his doing and some were not, and he liked it that men would not be able to tell. In the morning the yard was full of ash, and the smell was like a river in spring. Roose went to his counting room and counted quietly. He sent a raven to Winterfell that said they had been pressed and had held, and that he would require more heads to replace those that had been employed. The letter was courteous and gross. Catelyn read it with a face still as the surface of water before it is broken by a hand. Along the wall men set fire to the forest and watched it burn in sheets of blue and white and then black. The fire ate and then sated itself as a hound does, and lay back on its haunches to watch. In the gaps behind the fire the dead came still, with a patience that was not human. Jon shot until his fingers would not close on the string. Old Sam held up torches and lit and lit and lit again and moaned prayers to the seven into the wool of his scarf. Ygritte, who had known another bedtime than his and had died in another telling, stood shoulder to shoulder with a black brother whose name she had not bothered to learn, and loosed her last obsidian head and saw a pale thing come apart like a blown glass dropped on a stone floor. She grinned in the stinging cold and then spat, and her spittle froze before it fell. The others hated the black glass. There is no mind like ours in them, but there is a kind of preference, as frost has preferences for shade. The black glass took their cold and made it fragile. It cracked it slowly and beautifully, as a craftsman might work an egg of alabaster. In later years men would make art of that crack in their minds and tell stories around it as if it meant more than it had meant in the cold. In the moment, it meant the difference bet we. And dying as a man dies and dying as a thing dies. You cannot understand the gratitude men feel for a simple tool until you have stood behind a wall with a simple tool and outlived a knight that wanted you. Stannis Baratheon came north with Melisandre at his shoulder and Davos at his heart. He came not because of any love for the North or the Watch, but because the letter from Ned Stark had been one of the few letters he had ever received that did not pander or lie. He came because men had begun to say that the dead had come back to Amory Lorch's last camp and to a village in the Neck, and because men had begun to say that fire blackens snow in a way that is not pretty. He brought with him, from Dragonstone, the last of the obsidian that men had cut in the caves by faint firelight and stored in barrels because blade after blade had split under careless hands. He set it down at Castle Black like a miser pouring out his treasure to a brother he cannot forgive. "I brought this," he said shortly, "and I brought my sword. I do not have songs. I have work." Jeor Mormont, gray and shaggy as a winter dog, clasped his forearm. "Work is good," he said, "and we have the stone already." Stannis looked at the stacked barrels under the eaves, the neat rows of arrowheads laid out to dry after oiling, the free folk with red hands from binding shafts, the black brothers with a new light in their eyes that was not hope so much as grim habit. He looked at Jon Snow, who had something of Ned's face without Ned's quiet, and a wolf named Ghost who had taken to sleeping at the foot of the stairs to the Lord Commander's chambers like a man might sleep at the foot of a bed to guard it. He looked at the wall and looked beyond it. "You were wiser than me first," he said to no one men could see, and then louder. "We will put lines of fire along the treeline. We will build scorpions and tip them with this glass on iron shanks. We will not be fashionable. We will be alive." Alive is a fashion that men can learn. They learned it in the North. They learned to wrap their tools in oilcloth and then in more oilcloth and to store them away from damp. They learned to strike the chips from the black stone with a love that looked like hate if you didn't know stone. They learned to keep torches on hooks near their beds and to sleep lightly and to get up without a wasted breath. They taught their children to notch arrows with an obsidian head and not a steel one. The children took to it like a game, and then they had no game to play with the dead because their fathers kept them safe. In one of those nights when men say later that the stars were wrong, the dead found the tunnel beneath the wall at the night fort. The gate there was sealed with ice that remembered another age, and such ice can be persuaded if the persuader is strong enough. Where the moving cold came up against that memory of a closure the first men had made with blood, it wavered, and at last it thinly flowed through under over as fog finds the slit under a door. They came into the vault of the night fort and stood in that whispering dark where stone remembers more than men do. A boy named Gren, who had been told by Jon once to hold a line in a narrow place and believed it, stood there now in a different tale with 4 men and a barrel and a brazier. He did not have a giant with him this time. He had Dragonglass and a stubbornness that can be a better giant. They lit their torches and held the line, and the first 3 of the pale things splintered at the neck and dropped in cascades of glitter. Gren held his breath until it hurt and did not stand down until the brazier went blue. "Do not break," the note had said. "Do not waste." Jon said it to himself as he loosed down into the darkness, as if that litany itself were a call to a gods that the Septons did not have names for. When the arrowheads ran out at the Shadow Tower, the men there used their heads and their hands. They whittled the broken pieces of glass into new points with antler tine and bound them with sinew and grease. It was ugly work, and it worked, which is better than pretty work that does not. When the firewood dwindled, Jeor ordered the last timbers of an old dining hall cut down to feed the braziers, and if men felt a certain hollow in their guts as the beams went, they did not say. In the flat white of a late dusk at Queen's Crown, Jon and a handful of men found themselves cut off by wights that had moved faster than they had expected. The pond there was a mirror. The town's crowns rose broken teeth above the reeds. There was nothing grand about what they did. They did not charge, and no trumpets sounded. They lit rushes and thrust them into the faces of dead men and watched the faces go away in a smoke that had no smoke smell. They stabbed and broke and stabbed again, and the shards of obsidian glittered under the thin sun like something sinful. After, Jon stood under the tumbled stones of the old hall and listened to a quiet that was not peace, and he thought, "My father did this." He did not mean Jon himself. He meant the line that had put the stones to shafts and sent them. He felt it as one sometimes feels the pull of a tide when you cannot see the sea, which is to say in the knee and the mind. The dire wolves hunted that winter with cunning that would have been called human if men had humility. They went in twos sometimes. Ghost took a wight at the throat as if it had blood to choke and shook it until the spine was a string of beads. Shaggy Dog dragged legs off and tossed them like sticks into a fire a boy had lit, proud to be doing this whilst his mother slept with a knife under the pillow. Even Summer grew terrible, that sweet-named beast, and tore a pale rider from his mount and broke its face against a stone. If the others hated the black stone, they hated the wolves more. Hate is a measure of respect in its way. It tells you who your enemies are worth to you. In the South, men fought over chairs and forged letters and called on gods to bless their banners. In the North, men made piles of ash where dead men had walked. When news of it came to King's Landing, Circe ordered the gates closed early and drank wine and had a carpet moved and a new one laid where she could not bear to look at an old bloodstain that no one else could see. She asked Pycelle what obsidian cost, and he told her a number without understanding it. Littlefinger imagined new ways to sell old things. Varys listened and hummed and sent a boy to find him a flake of glass to put in his sleeve that he might show it to someone, sometime, flavored with a story. In White Harbor, Wyman Manderley fed the hungry and kept the ship sailing and had men fashion long iron bolts shod with dragonglass heads on rings of copper and leather so that the glass would not shatter in flight. He had a scorpion built on the roof of the wolf's den and practiced with it at night when fog came in, because he did not want the South to see what he was doing and because fog deadens sound in a way that makes men think of ghosts. At Bear Island, Daisy Mormont stood on the beach with a great spear that had been her father's once and then her aunt's and now hers, and drove it into the chest of a thing that came out of the surf with seaweed in its hair. "Not today," she said through clenched teeth to whatever gods heard a Mormont on a shore. The women of the island did not cry that day. They had too much to do. They had children to tie little knives onto and balls of pitch to light and throw. They wrote to Winterfell to say that the first 3 ships to Bay of Ice had not come, and that the 4th had brought news of fires seen all along the coast like a chain of light. They asked for more glass and did not bother to be courteous in it, which Ned would have liked if he had been alive to see it, and Robb liked it and sent the glass with a smile that looked like his father's. Arya Stark, from far from home, ran wherever the wind would let her and learned a different kind of stabbing in a different kind of dark. Her hands became a map of nick and bruise and healed cut. She once stole an obsidian knife from a captain's chest in a town that had fires set on the hills and carried it for a week until a woman who had given her wine and not asked her name needed it more. In another story, she might have killed a king with that knife. In this one, she killed a man who was not a man, an empty suit of cold presence, and afterward she did not feel as if a song should be written for her. She felt a little sad and ate an apple. She did not cry. She kept the shards and later traded them for bread. Sansa sang in a keep that had scents of rosewater and old fear. She sang not for kings but for children on a night when the moon was hiding. She thought of Winterfell and the Godswood and of men who wore black and a girl who had always been dirty at the elbows. And she sang an old song about a knight who fights a winter and does not die but only becomes a tree. She did not know why she sang that one. There are songs that know you better than you know yourself. The last great press came late, when men had begun to think perhaps the dead had tired of their work. They do not tire. They do not understand the word. They came at the wall with the bitter last of a north wind, and in their spears the snow itself burned cold blue. The Watch and the Free Folk Sally rallied perhaps for the last time men would ever do such a thing. Stannis stood in a place where his life could most easily be taken and did not move. He had things to prove and no song to prove them with. He had a sword that burned and a face that did not. He had barrels of glass at his back and men who did not love him but who had learned his kind of stubbornness in their own long winters. The battle that was not a battle but a night-long breaking happened mostly in silence. Sound in such cold is a delicate thing. Torches hiss when lit. Men breathe in pulled strings. Glass cracks like truth. When the pale things broke, they broke beautifully and then they were gone. And that in itself felt an offense, as if something so difficult to kill should leave a piece behind for you to show to someone to say, "Here, I did this. Believe me." But the snow takes what it wants. Took those 2. John killed 3 of the others that night. Ghost killed 2. There was a moment when the line wavered where the night fort's tunnel joined the shelves of ice and Gren's friends went white around the mouth, not from cold, and Gren would not break. And he held his spear and shoved again. There was a moment when Stannis looked to his right and saw a man he had thought soft put his shoulder to a scorpion and bend his life into it and fire a bolt that took a pale rider through the chest and threw it backward off the wall into a mist that lit from under as if fires burned under the ice itself. There was a moment when Melisandre's fire went up in a column and the snow around it became glass sheets and then shattered, and the broken pieces fell and sang, a high sound, and then were ground under boots and lost. Near dawn, which is kinder in the north, the cold receded in a long sigh like a giant falling asleep. The dead that were left lay down and did not rise. The flames burned ordinary orange. Men leaned on spears and did not drop them. When the sun slid up, it was a small sun and pale as milk, and it did not warm anyone. But it came. After, when they counted, which men always do, they found fewer bodies than they had feared to find. The wall had held. The gates had held. No other had set foot south of the wall in that long press. There had been incursions to holdfasts and barrows. Aye, and there had been dead among the living that no one could pretend were not there. But the line had held. They did not know whether the dead would come back in a week or a year. They cleaned their tools and oiled them and packed more heads. They dug more pits for pitch. They wrote to White Harbor and to Dragonstone and to Bear Island and back again. They kept habits. They slept a little, and in their sleep they saw eyes like ice chips and woke and lit a candle and watched it burn. In Winterfell, the Godswood's snow had a crust that would hold a boy's weight if he moved lightly. Bran walked there in his dreams because his walking had become a different thing by then, and he saw things that men do not say out loud. He saw a man with quiet in him give orders to a smith. He saw a woman with hair like autumn stand at a window with her hands flat and breathe in and out like the tide. He saw wolves running between trees, and he saw his father in the crypts, not moving. He went south and north and up and down. He saw obsidian in a cave cut long ago where little hands had set it down on a shelf like a promise. He woke and told no one, because how would he? He touched the face of the heart tree and felt a hum like a hive. When Catelyn received the last letter her lord had written, which had been sitting in a Ravenry's corner for a week due to a storm in the fingers and a lazy boy, she held it a long time before breaking the seal. The wax split like skin under a dull knife. The letter said nothing the other letters had not said. It had a line at the bottom that read, "Take care that the black heads are wrapped twice in oilcloth and that the bundles go to Karstark without passing through the Dreadfort. Tell Arya to mind her laces. Tell Sansa to sing. Kiss Bran." It was the most like him of all of them. She did not weep. She put away her tears. She went down to the armory and asked to see the barrels, and Hallis Malin undid one and let her put her hand in. The heads were slick and a little greasy. They were child fist size, cold and heavy. She lifted one and held it to her cheek for a second, and then set it back among its brothers. She said to Hallis, "See that you double the rags for pitch on each pike." Robb stood looking out over the yard at men drilling point down, point up, thrust, recover. He had become a young man with a quiet he had not had when he laughed most of each day and through snow. He still laughed sometimes. He laughed with gray wind at his side and with Theon when the Ironborn was in a mood to be human. He laughed with Meage Mormont when she told him a joke that would have made Sansa put her fingers in her ears and over her eyes. But he laughed less. The war in the south had made him older. The winter in the north had made him deliberate. He had his cup in his hand, and he had his father's look once, the one that weighed. "We will go on," he said. "We will go on whether the South remembers us or not." The South remembered, bloody and badly. It made a different set of songs than men in the North sang around low fires. The songs had more gold and less ash. But from time to time, in a tavern in the Reach, some man would take out a black flake and set it on the table and say, "Here," and the others would look and say, "That is common glass," and he would say, "No," and they would not believe him until he produced a cut on his finger and a tale from a cousin's house about a night when the dead had come out of a mound a little ways off the road and gone down into a cellar because the door had been left open, and then they might listen, and a few of them might bring a torch to bed for a week, and then they would forget again, because forgetting is the South's way. The North did not forget, kept its barrels and its sockets. It moved more glass from Dragonstone when it could, and knocked more from cliffs on Skagos when hard men went there and dared. The mountain clans came down with more knowledge of how to flake and not break, and they taught boys to do it and girls to do it, and then they went home again with a skin of beer and a half-smile and a pocket full of coins that would spend in the hills. There was no statue raised to the black stone in any square, and men did not make a feast of it, because you do not feast for your shovel or your hemp rope. But when the old men spoke and the hearth flames leaned sometimes and the children shuddered and smiled, they told the tale of how a lord had believed a thing when it was still only a story, and how he had bought stone with coin and with stubbornness, and how when winter came with a face and hands the North was ready to lay hand on haft and not shake. Years later, when the last of that cold had drained away into the ground and men had started to speak of it more comfortably, when there were tournaments again in the South and songs about girls with hair like spun gold and a few grim songs about men with black hands who lit the night, the godswood at Winterfell stood as it had always stood, and the heart tree stared with its sad red eyes at the pool and the sky. In the crypts below, a man carved in stone kept his sword across his knees. Sometimes a boy would go down and stand before that man and see in the flicker of a candle a more generous mouth than the sculptor's chisel had given, and a patience that did not resemble resignation. And the boy would think, he did this. He put a thing into men's hands, and the thing bit where it had to bite. No one sang about barrels and sockets, but men lived, and boys were given spears with black heads, and girls tied knives to their boots and did not think it odd. And in the memory of trees, where men's words go if they are heavy enough, there was a long, cool satisfaction, as if a root had found water and would drink a long time.